This guy has had quite a life. He's been a musical producer for Nick Drake, Pink Floyd, REM, 10,000 Maniacs, made the documentary Jimi Hendrix and the documentary Amazing Grace. Joe Boyd. This fella's been around. My name's Mischke. Joe Boyd graduated from Harvard in '64, tour managed Muddy Waters, was production manager for the '65 Newport Folk Festival, the one where Dylan went electric. Then after Newport, he moves to London and opens up Elektra Records. Now he's got a book out, a gigantic book. It's a doorstop. It's just under 1,000 pages. In this sweeping history, compiled from more than a decade of travel, more than a decade of research, interviews, a lifetime of listening, Joe Boyd has explored centuries of extraordinary backstories to the musical sounds that the world has known over the years. In his book, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, he shows how personalities, events in places all over the world have been as momentous as anything that took place in New Orleans, the great music that came out of there, Harlem, the wonderful sounds from there, Laurel Canyon in California, Liverpool, the sounds that emanated from there, and how jazz and rhythm and blues and rock and roll really would never have happened if it weren't for the musical notes and the wondrous rhythms that have emanated from far over the horizon. The result of all his efforts over the many years, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, a journey through global music. 900 plus pages and an absolute celebration of the music that has shaped the world. And Joe is in London. We are ready to commence this conversation. I've looked forward to this since closing the cover of his book, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, author Joe Boyd. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be talking to the Twin Cities. I love the Twin Cities. Thanks for having me.
I look at this book, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain, and I think about all the places you took me in this book and all the ways you connected the world to the music I grew up with, to the music I listen to now. And I think, what happens to this man when he hears music? And is it different than what happens to somebody else?
You know, my first experiences of listening to music, I think, when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, my grandmother had been a concert pianist, and in later life, she prepared other concert pianists for the recitals. And I used to sit under the piano and listen to her. And I don't know, I think that experience entered me in a kind of deep way. And obviously there was something genetic that meant I was receptive to it. And then, you know, when I heard my mother's Edith Piaf records, or when I started hearing Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and when I just started discovering jazz and listening to Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, there was something, certain tracks and certain artists would touch some part of me that had been somehow revved up or warmed up by my grandmother, that had been sensitized, so that I recognized when Louis Armstrong hits that high note in West End blues, I just went, oh yeah, oh yeah. And I can't intellectualize exactly what that sensation was, except, it's a bit like trying to describe, sexual arousement,
Right.
or something.
Right.
There isn't really the language for it.
As you say that, I think about a passage in your book where you were talking about European music and comparing it to some West African music. And you made the statement, and I hope I have this right, that unlike the European music, the African music that you were writing about in this passage was intended to put you in a trance state. I stopped at that passage and thought, that trance state is what I look for in any music I encounter. If a music can't do that, it's probably not going to be something I want to listen to a lot. I may listen to it some, but I am looking for that state.
Yeah. I believe the part of my book where I mention that point is in talking about some writers in Cuba in the 1930s. There was a battle going on because a lot of Cubans were kind of horrified with how popular Afro-Cuban music was becoming, and how France and New York and London were all going crazy for Latin rhythms. And they felt it was shameful. Cuba shouldn't be represented to the outside world by this very African sounding rhythm because, they saw Cuba as a white culture, the Spanish culture. And these intellectuals who were sort of on the left politically, they were fierce in defending the popularity of Afro-Cuban music. But they wrote about it. They said, well, we think it's really important and we think it's really valuable, but it does sometimes go on too long and it doesn't change and it just stays in one groove. And I say that actually that's the point. If you get a fantastic rhythm section that finds a groove and just sticks with it, and the dancers get more and more intensely hypnotized by it almost, and there's a feedback between the dancers and the rhythm section, that's heaven musically. But for a lot of people who didn't understand that or were sort of coming at it from a Eurocentric point of view, they're going, wait a minute, where's the chord change? Where's
Yeah.
the melody?
Yeah.
Where's this going? It's supposed to go A, B, B to C, and then the climax, and then a bridge. Where's the bridge? And so I was just making that comparison. What is music about? European music over the centuries, evolved in very sophisticated ways, but it was all about melody and harmony. Whereas in Cuba, all these different African cultures from all over the African continent were mixing and meeting each other and bumping up against each other in Havana and Santiago and Matanzas, in the bars and in the dance halls, and creating something as complex rhythmically as what the Europeans were coming up with harmonically.
When the Europeans bring their musical influence to America, by and large, the one thing they're not bringing with them is a drum.
Right. And that, I would tell you, that was one of the great moments of research. I read this wonderful book by a guy called Ned Sublette, Cuba and Its Music. He goes deep back into the history of all the forces that shaped Cuban music. And he had this paragraph in one of the early chapters about Spain in the 5th century AD. It was in chaos. Roman Empire had fallen apart, and the Pope wanted to bring order. The church then went on a crusade against heresy and paganism all across Europe. Getting rid of pagan practice effectively meant getting rid of drums, because drums were associated with ritual worship of pagan gods, of different deities. And drums were considered not just pagan, but also sensual. The early Christian church was obsessed with stopping women from moving during the music. The whole thing of scarves that women had to wear is basically to stop their hair from swaying when they sing. It excites the man. And so there was this real crusade, and they really pretty much eliminated drums. I mean, if you see those Bruegel paintings of a medieval village with a dance and a fair and everything, and somebody playing a bagpipe and somebody else playing a lute or something, you don't see any drums. They were gone. And so Europe was drum free. And it wasn't until the military They were useful to get soldiers pumped up for battle. And so you had snare drum, cymbal, and bass drum, all military. And if you think about the jazz drum kit, it's all military drums. There's a snare drum sitting up there on top of the bass drum. In New Orleans, somebody figured out it was cheaper to hire one drummer instead of three to play with a jazz band or a dance band. And so they rigged up this kind of weird contraption. And that's the modern drum kit, the way of harnessing military drums. Which is completely different from Afro-Cuban drums, which were always hit with the hand. People found that very primitive and very African and rather menacing, to see somebody pounding drums with a hand. It's like in Westerns, that's how you know the Indians are nearby. Dum, dum, dum. It's considered menacing and primitive to polite Western society.
Joey Manillo cannot walk 5 steps without tripping over his shoelaces, but you can't sew shoelaces. So Joey just falls down a lot. However, Joey recently got hit by a runaway hot dog cart in downtown Minneapolis. Picture Joey lying there, mustard everywhere, looking like a soggy pretzel. And who do you suppose he called? Bradshaw and Bryant, that's who. And they don't just take the case. Bradshaw and Bryant dance circles around it, making insurance guys sweat bullets, sweat like Richard Simmons, weep like schoolgirls who missed out on Jelly Bean Day. Joey is getting paid, enough to buy a whole bunch of hot dog carts and a big facility to store them in. If life smacks you in the face with a literal or metaphorical hot dog cart, call Bradshaw and Bryant. Learn more at MinnesotaPersonalInjury.com. I have used MSP, as in Minneapolis St. Paul Plumbing, Heating, and Air, for years. I've not considered using any other plumbing, heating, or cooling company because I've learned too much about the business. My dear pal, who I met when we were 7 years old, has sat with me often and has told me all the inside scoop. He's woken me up to why some companies out there are pretty cheap. They'll say they're inexpensive, but I've learned the word is cheap, and the customer is cheated from getting high-quality, skilled plumbing, heating, and air conditioning work. I've also learned from him why some companies are quite expensive. No, they're not doing the customer a favor either. They're taking more than they're giving. I've gone with MSP because they're not the cheapest and they're not the most expensive. They're just the best. MSP. I want to go to your early days when you got out of Harvard, just because it's the 60th anniversary of Dylan going electric at Newport. 60 years this summer. And you were there. You were there for that moment. It's one of those things where, there's only so many people in this world who were there. And with the Dylan movie out, a lot of people talk about this, but you were able to take it in, and you talk about it as though you were caught in the eye of a hurricane.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely moments in history. You look back 10, 20 years later and you think, we didn't realize it then, but history was changing. But this was not that sort of moment. Everybody knew that this was huge. This was a hinge of some kind in history. There's a film that was on PBS at one point called The Other Side of the Mirror. It's all of Dylan's appearances at Newport from 63, 64, and 65. And 63, he's this young kid. He's singing a ballad about a coal miner. And you see him, Pete Seeger, and traditional singers sitting around him on stage, nodding in great appreciation of what he's doing. You see him joining hands with the Freedom Singers and the Weavers and Joan Baez at the end of Sunday night to sing We Shall Overcome. And then you have 64. Dylan is introduced by Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger says, people call him the voice of a generation. Please welcome Bob Dylan. And he comes up and he plays for the first time in public, Mr. Tambourine Man. A few months earlier, Blowin' in the Wind had been number one on the hit parade by Peter, Paul, and Mary. And he's singing Tambourine Man. And there's a shot of Seeger on stage behind him with his head in his hands, like, oh my God, what is this? This is not a song you're going to sing while you're out on the barricades protesting. This is not a song that's going to inspire the masses to fight against oppression. What is this? What the hell is this about? And then 64 July to 65 July, I mean, so many things happened, including the record producer and manager of the Byrds, Jim Dixon, had been in the audience when Dylan sang Mr. Tambourine Man, and he never could get it out of his head. And he went back to LA. He put together these different singers in different commercial folk groups in LA, singing around the clubs. Roger McGuinn, David Crosby, Gene Clark, and he called them the Beefeaters or something to try and sound English. And they released some single, it didn't work. But he couldn't get this song out of his head. And he called up Albert Grossman and persuaded Dylan's manager to send him a dub of Mr. Tambourine Man. And the group worked out this arrangement of it. And David Crosby was very skeptical. He thought this is not a good idea. And he was refusing to record it. And so Dixon found out that Dylan was going to be in LA. And he persuaded Grossman to bring Dylan down to the rehearsal room where they were working. And so the Byrds played Mr. Tambourine Man, their arrangement of it, for Dylan. And Dylan just grinned. And at the end, he said, hey, man, you can dance to that. And he gave it his blessing. And so they went in the studio, they changed their name to the Byrds, which is like a misspelling of an animal like the Beatles. And they put the record out and it soared up the charts. And so when we're getting ready for Newport, the 65 July, there's the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man, all over the radio. This is not the folk scene. This is big business. This is show business. This is top 40 radio. And then Dylan releases Like a Rolling Stone, 6 minutes long. Nobody put out 6-minute long singles, but it got played and it got onto the charts. So in the weeks leading up to the festival, everybody who comes to the festival, working at the festival, musicians playing at the festival, the audiences who are coming there to listen, they're all hearing the Byrds, they're hearing Dylan on top 40 radio. They're also hearing Sonny and Cher, I Got You, Babe, in which Sonny is doing a kind of impression of Dylan. And so it's like suddenly this is not just the issue of what Dylan is going to do, because he'd also released this record that was half electric, half acoustic. So he obviously was drawn towards making records with electric guitars and bass and drums. But everybody, all during the days leading up to the final night of Newport, everybody, the constant theme of discussion was, what's he going to do? What's Dylan going to do? Would he dare? And I know it seems quaint from distance of 60 years later that the electric guitar issue was such a big deal. But it was, it just was. There was the Newport Folk Festival, and the folk movement as a whole felt itself to be a kind of bubble of authenticity, purity, high ethical standards. And somehow the difference between an electric guitar and an acoustic guitar had come to represent that divide. Even with blues, people loved Mississippi John Hurt. They loved Reverend Gary Davis. They loved Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry, who all played acoustic blues. People didn't know quite what to make of Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf and B.B. King. Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf were on Chess Records, along with Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley. So were they part of that scene, part of that world? Nobody was sure. It was a bit awkward. And so that when Dylan came out on stage on Sunday night with a band, and we had done a sound check, we sound checked everybody, including Dylan, so that when the first note of Maggie's Farm hit, it was loud. And one reason, it wasn't just, I've been thinking about this because a lot of people have said in retrospect that it wasn't that it was electric that bothered Pete Seeger or bothered a lot of people. It was how loud it was. And they're right, in a way. It was certainly, I think, the loudest thing that a lot of people had heard. But I was thinking about it, watching the movie. I thought to myself, they did a very good job of recreating that era. But the one anachronism that I saw, I spotted a few anachronisms. And one of them I spotted was on stage. They had a stage monitor, a little speaker aimed backwards towards the singer. It's standard equipment on stages. But it didn't exist in 1965. We didn't have monitors. There were no stage monitors. And Mike Bloomfield, the guitar player, I loved Mike. He was a great guy and he was a great guitar player. But he was really psyched up that night. He was really on it. And he cranked his guitar up. He was playing really loud. And that was what was reaching the audience, was this really loud guitar noise from the amp. And Paul Rothschild had to crank up the rest of the band, the drum mics, the vocal mic, the keyboard, etc., to match Mike Bloomfield's guitar. And so the result was this really loud noise, probably louder than anyone had ever heard. It was really shocking. And at the end of the first number, I still feel I'm right. I mean, despite people argue about this, but I think it was really 50-50. Half the audience was going boo and half the audience was going more. And at the end, when Dylan leaves after 3 numbers, for sure, there was a mixture of boo and more. These two sounds, more and boo, once you get past the consonant at the front of the word, they sound the same. And so there's just this huge kind of roar from the crowd. And I was on the side of Dylan at the time. I thought it was great what he was doing. In retrospect, he really blew folk music out of the water.
Yes.
Newport never really recovered. It was kind of a shame.
Yeah, I find myself thinking about Pete sometimes and that purity idea. It may have its place in this world from time to time. I often wonder what it would have been like had Woody been on stage, what his take would have been. He was a little bit more loose than Pete.
Yeah. And also, I think Pete was disturbed by how people focused on his unhappiness. And somebody recently, because of all the talk, and I'm kind of a part of a network of people who endlessly, I guess, get asked periodically to comment on what people say or what people think. Somebody sent me a photograph of a postcard that Pete Seeger wrote to Dylan 6 months after Newport, basically saying that he wants Bob to understand that he didn't have a problem with the drums and the electric guitar, that Howling Wolf had been on Newport stage the year before, and Muddy Waters and the Swan Silvertones with electric guitars. It wasn't about electric guitars. It was kind of about attitude and the fact that Dylan was turning his back on the idealism of the cause of the political folk song movement represented by Woody and Pete, and for a few years, Dylan.
Yeah, and I find myself sometimes thinking, was there anybody like him in this respect? You hear so often, give the people what they want, give them what they're looking for. They're here paying, feed them the flavors they like. And I don't know anybody who so often said, well, I'm not going to do that. I just hope they like what I'm serving. The young Dylan, the kid who grew up in Minnesota, was very ambitious and
Yeah.
wanted to be big. He would look in the window of a record store and see Elvis, and he'd say, I want to be that. Well, to do that, often you have to give people what they want a lot of the time. You don't flip them off too often, or whatever you would call different things that he's done where it was so clearly an about face or something that his fans would have said, whoa, 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 wait, you're born again Christian now? Wait a minute. There's so many times where what he's doing seems to be something that's not going to work out well in terms of bringing the audience along. Somehow, he endlessly brings an audience along.
There's some basic truths in that perspective on artistic choices. To get to be successful with a small s, you have to give people what they want. But if you look at the people who get to be successful with a capital S, you don't. In fact, it's counterproductive. The more you defy the audience and you lead them and you force them to follow you, the more powerful you become. But not very many people have the balls to do that, or the bravado. Neil Young is another one who's constantly going a different way than what his followers want from him. And I talk about Paul Simon in the book. Nobody could have imagined in a million years that what people wanted from Paul Simon in 1986 was an album with a South African backing band. It takes that kind of gumption and courage in a way, or just certainty about what you're doing. And, you read biographies of Beethoven, and he was doing stuff that nobody thought was going to work, that horrified people. It was dissonant. It was annoying. It was all these things. And those are the ones that end up carved into music Mount Rushmores.
Close your eyes. You hear the pop of a movie reel. You smell fresh ice cream. Sunlight warms your face in a courtyard. Somewhere, scissors snip in a salon. Believe it or not, you're at the Wellshire of Bloomington and Medina, a residential memory care center. 4 different quadrants for the 4 different stages of memory care. But the people in all 4 feel known, feel safe, feel alive. Staff move like loving shadows around these people. They're trusted. The staff has been there for years. They've watched memory slip, and they've gently caught it. They remember what others forget. How to listen, how to laugh, how to make a day matter. The Wellshire of Bloomington and Medina, where stories bloom, where hands are held, where life hums in every corner. Dirt, grime, grit is alive. It's alive. It whispers. It plots. It thinks it owns your warehouse, your industrial facility, your machinery. But then American pressure rolls in. At American pressure, they make pressure washers roar like angry lions with lion turbojets. The grime, it screams bloody murder. The grit, it hightails it for the woods. Your floors, your machines, your rigs, your plant shines so bright the sun goes blind. American pressure service trucks aren't trucks. They're weapon repair vehicles in the war against filth. They'll fix your pressure washer or provide you with a better one. They have thousands of parts in stock also. Decades of wisdom, too. Hands that know the language of pressure and steel. And they are a godsend to your business. Remember them? American Pressure.
Music.
Music.
Music. Music.
Music. Music.
Music.
Music.
Music.
Music.
Music.
You mentioned Paul Simon. I think of periods in history and being there for them. I would put this right up there with 65 and Newport. You're there in the 80s with Paul Simon. at this party, and this moment to me is like 65 in Newport, in that it's this historic moment. Of course, nobody knows it's historic, but it is historic. He is playing you the backing tracks for what ultimately will be his album Graceland, which was a revolutionary album and just a wondrous thing. But he's not there yet. He's just been experimenting with these wonderful musicians from South Africa, and he's playing these backing tracks that he originally likes, but he doesn't have any songs yet. He's just kind of, what am I going to do with all this? So he starts to write words that would become the lyrics to the songs in the album Graceland. But you're with him at this party, and I can't even fathom this scene where he's playing you the backing tracks at the party and singing you the lyrics he's come up with to go with the backing tracks. He's singing live to you, and you are hearing what will become Graceland, and I can't fathom what you're thinking.
Well, I was stunned because I fancied myself somebody who knew about South African music. I had a couple of Ladysmith albums in my collection. I had a Mkwanga compilation that I loved, but I thought, I'm one of these record collecting nerds, who think I've got all this stuff, nobody knows about it, And, I've had that experience sometimes of having friends who I love, and who are great. We could talk about literature and politics, and we're all in accord, and I'll drop the needle on something that I think is wonderful, that is weird and strange or new to them. And they go, "Oh yeah, that's really great, Joe. Thanks. That's really nice to hear," and change the subject. And so I kind of felt like this South African music would fall in that category. And hearing these tracks and hearing Paul, and we're sitting on a kind of like an ottoman, like a big cushion thing right next to one of the speakers of the sound system in the room. And he just leans into my ear and just starts singing. I've written some words, and he sings me, Boy in the Bubble or whatever it is. And it just sounded fantastic. I mean, I just was floored.
Graceland is just one example of so many in the book, and The Roots of Rhythm Remain. So many examples where, as an American, I'm taking in music that is following a vein from far away and from centuries ago, and you make the reader feel these connections. And so often in the book, I'm listening in my head as I'm reading, and I'm following that line back to where it came from. I've heard you say all music is mongrel, a mix of all sorts of things, just like culture is mongrel. Different things are coming together to make something. You write, late one hot Saturday afternoon in 1958, 3 white teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, lay sprawled on the sand next to their small boat, its outboard motor beached and lifeless. Having left the dock in Kingston, Jamaica, without much water or fuel, and pushed down the coast by tides and wind, they were hungry, they were thirsty, they were exhausted, and now the sun was setting. At dawn, after a sleepless, mosquito-plagued night, the boy who had borrowed the boat and gotten them into this mess set out along the sandbar, separated from the coastal road by miles of marsh and mangrove swamp. After hours trudging through soft sand, he saw a fisherman's shack and a black man with long matted hair peering out at him. Chris Blackwell had been taught to fear and avoid the strange tribe of outcasts who called themselves Rastafarians. But thirst overcame trepidation, and he hesitantly asked for some water. After explaining what had happened, he lay down and quickly fell asleep. When he awoke, it was dark, and he was surrounded by Rastas. They fed him roast fish and told him the others had been towed safely back to port. Thus did Blackwell come by his affection and respect for those who revere Ras Tafari, then Emperor of Ethiopia. 14 years after that Sunday morning, when long matted hair was still a startling sight, 3 Rastas turned up at his Island Records office in London. He welcomed them, chatted about the latest news from Kingston. He listened to their ideas, and he wrote out a check for £4,000, enough to finance Reggae Music's first album project. He trusted them. Their names were Bunny Livingston, Peter Tosh, and Bob Marley, and the relationship between the world and Jamaican music would never again be the same. For everybody out there listening who has ever tapped their foot to a reggae song, who's ever enjoyed Bob Marley delivering some music on a Saturday afternoon, just that moment changes how I will hear reggae every time I listen to it.
One of the geneses of this book is the hallway in my flat. I have bookshelves on both sides, and I'm obsessive organizer of books. So I have books that are basically about America on one side and books about Britain on the other side. And right at eye level, like 3 or 4 rows on both sides, are music books in the middle of both sections. And so every time I walk down the hall, I'm passing Guralnick's books about Elvis and his book about Sam Cooke, and I'm passing biographies of John Lennon, and I'm passing, Jarvis Cocker's new book, and I'm passing biographies of Louis Armstrong, and there's so many great stories. I had that same feeling you described now, reading Guralnick writing about Elvis, 16-year-old or 17 or whatever he was, walking into Sun Records and very shyly asking the receptionist how much it would cost to record a demo, not to try out to become an artist for Sun Records, but to give as a present to his mother. And that was the first step in his career, that he went into the studio at Sun to record a track for his mom. And Sam Phillips heard it and said, "Hey, wait a minute, kid, why don't you try singing something with a band here?" And that moment, gives me goosebumps.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's just these little stories about how suddenly they had this sound and they had this record. And that every piece of music that is iconic and totemic has a story. If you follow it back, nothing ever happens by some sort of laid out path, by some sort of predictable route. If you follow it back, there's some incredible moment of coincidence, or some incredible moment of inspiration, or some incredible accident that happens in the studio, and something magical happens in that moment.
Boy, when you mention Elvis, the first thing that comes to my mind, and it was just a small little paragraph. I mean, this book travels all over the world, and we learn about so many wondrous kinds of music from so many exotic and beautiful, wondrous places. But just the little part of your book where you say back in the 40s, young Elvis Presley would never miss a release by Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. The classic explanation of rock and roll as a meeting of blues and country tells only part of the story. Dean Martin's Italian crooning is all over Elvis's vocal style, false bass and all, to say nothing of the slicked dark hair falling over his forehead. Cuban music is also cited as an ingredient, the basis for rock and roll's syncopation entering America's musical bloodstream via the left-hand patterns Professor Longhair developed while jamming with Cuban sailors in New Orleans dockside bars. But equally intriguing is a short film used as an opener for Martin and Lewis's films. Watching Desi Arnaz and his orchestra, I am struck by how Desi's hair, Desi's stance, the way he holds his conga drum, and the way he moves around on stage reminds me so much of Elvis. A lot of America's musical heritage seems to have taken shape in 1949 in the dark of a Memphis cinema. Again, you place it somewhere. Something is happening. A series of things are coming together. Disparate things are coming together. And what's being born there, no one can know who's witnessing it. But now that we do know, it just makes it magical, these moments.
Well, I'm delighted that you take that from the book. You're my ideal reader. That's what I was hoping for, because those moments fascinate me. As I said, that was the inspiration. One of the inspirations for the book was all these moments. I knew that there were stories just as good in other cultures. in distant lands, far away from Liverpool and Laurel Canyon, equally wonderful, like the Chris Blackwell story. And there's stories in Cuba, there's stories in Brazil, there's stories in Argentina, and stories in Bulgaria and Russia and India that are all like that, that are all as magical and wonderful as that. And I just thought it was time somebody told them.
The way you isolated a place in America, a city in America, as almost a different country. I think you talk about New York City at one point as just kind of having its own law, that it was wholly different from everywhere else. And what was happening there, while it would influence other parts of the country, no way could any of those things happen and be embraced anywhere else in the country at that time. It was a place where certain things could be born, come together from all around the world, and this new thing could form. New York, at one point, the future was being born there and there alone.
And it was based on immigration. It was a city of immigrants. You had wave after wave. And I recently read a book called Call It Sleep. And a lot of it is about language, about the way he encounters the Italian kids in the next block and the way they talk to each other with the different accents, and the way then the Irish policeman talks to them in his accent. And you have this incredible melding. And that's what you had at the Palladium. A lot of Cubans had migrated to New York. A lot of Puerto Ricans had migrated to New York. And there was a big African-American population. There was Italians, there was Jews. They all loved the Palladium. And of course, my favorite account of the Palladium that I quote quite a lot in the book is Bill Graham. He was an orphan, Eastern European Jewish orphan post-World War II, adopted by a family in the Bronx, brought up in New York, poor family, struggling. But then he discovered Latin dancing, and he just went nuts. He just loved it. And he used to go dancing at night, take his books, do his homework in a coffee house, park his books in the coat check room at the Palladium, dance until 3 a.m., and then go do some more work in an all-night cafeteria and show up for high school the next morning with his lessons done.
Yeah, you really make the reader want to be at the Palladium in the late 40s. And you're right, what poured from the stage was no gimmick. Numbers extended for 15 minutes and more with conga battles, horn solos. They rose to a sweat-soaked crescendo. The dance floor was a revelation that could only have happened in New York. Cubans, Italians, Puerto Ricans, Jews, African Americans, the rich rubbing shoulders with the poor, expert movers. The crowd became as big an attraction as the bands. Getting out of high school as Bill Graham and going down there to see that. And you do a wonderful job, too, of setting it up, because it's not just that scene, it's what set up that scene. And what sets up that scene is the end of World War II. You talk about the famous VJ Day photo of the Times Square kiss and how it symbolized the joy of that moment in American history. You write, the country had no refugee camps, no rubble to clear. Vast spending on the conflict had swept away the Depression. What would these unleashed party animals choose for their soundtrack? What rhythm would they move to? What steps would they dance to? This was this moment after World War II where it seemed everything had changed and we were ready for something wildly new. And New York City is just this beautiful place where it's all going to start to happen, and it'll spread out everywhere. And of course, as we learn, New York City was also where it was all being fed into from around the world, from all these cultures. It's just this magical place at this time.
But that, to me, is one of the great thrills of music.
I'll leave it there. I kept you longer than I wanted to, but that's the problem when you talk about this subject.
I appreciate all your good words. I really enjoyed this. Thanks for having me on.
Have you ever felt the wind having a lovely conversation with your hair? That's what effortlessly tooling down the road on an e-bike from EcoFun Motorsports feels like. You're smiling riding your e-bike, smiling like the world just confessed its secrets to you. Hills? Hills? They don't exist. Sweat? A laughable myth. Every push of the pedal just kind of whispers, "We got this, partner. Piece of cake." While that electric motor quietly laughs at all gravity. EcoFun Motorsports is having an e-bike sale. Get there. Burnsville, Forest Lake. You're invited to try them out. You're invited to touch the future. You'll laugh at how easy it is to go farther, to go faster, to ride happier. The EcoFun Motorsports e-bike sale in Forest Lake and Burnsville. All right, stop whatever you're doing. Imagine your 401k riding a unicycle on a tightrope, okay, over a pit of flaming spreadsheets. Now imagine Josh Arnold stepping in with a giant foam finger and yelling, "Hey, I got this. Hey, I'm Josh Arnold." Mischke, what was that? Was that the start of an ad? Josh has been lassoing and herding people's investments for 40 years. He'll give you 48 minutes, 48, not 47, not 49, to help you make sense of what you got going out there. Free of charge. Okay, free. You got that, sportsman? Free. You can talk stocks, bonds, mutual funds, whatever your money is up to, you talk to Josh about that. You're going to leave laughing and hugging your calculator. You're going to leave knowing exactly where your money should be.
Investment services offered by Josh Arnold Investment Consultant LLC, a security and investment advisor. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All investments involve risk. Tommy Mischke is a paid endorser.
Well, I think it's time to pull out the listener caller list. The list of folks who have asked me to give them a ring sometime. I like that. They say, "Give me a ring sometime, Mischke." They text me at 651-321-8949, and they say, "Give me a ring sometime, Mischke." And I add them to the list. It's a big old phone book. And I randomly just grab a name and call them up. I'm not going to start repeating visits with folks until I get through all the people I haven't talked to yet. I eventually hope to talk to every listener out there. And I don't mean just listeners of my program. I mean every listener who's ever listened to anything, whether it's a podcast, a radio show, their mom calling them to supper, a police officer calling out for them to stop or he'll shoot. There are people out there who have been deaf from birth. They have never heard a thing. I will not call them. That is something I will not do. Am I drawing a line in the sand? You're darn right I am. Unconventional, bold? That's me. Let's see who we got here. Here's someone named Steve, and he has a phone number for me. Okay.
Hello, Steve Johnston.
Well, hello there, Steve. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing fine. How you been, Tommy?
I've been good. What am I catching you doing?
I'm having a fine deluxe meal here at the Burger King.
Where would that Burger King be? What city?
La Hui on the island of Kauai in Hawaii.
No kidding. They have Burger Kings there, too. I thought the food would be a tad bit more exotic.
There aren't very many restaurants here on Kauai. COVID knocked a lot of them out of business, so they're only very slowly recovering.
Tell me about Kauai.
Well, it's kind of a garden spot. It's a really beautiful island, pretty small. There's one highway, 2-lane only.
Steve, what the devil are you doing there?
I've been in radio engineering for many years, and the job here was a shortwave broadcast station that is specifically about the time and frequency from the federal government.
You're an engineer at a shortwave radio station?
That's right, yep. But it's a very unusual one, although a shortwave station is unusual enough. But this is specifically a government station that sends out the exact frequency and the exact time for other organizations to use as a standard.
Is that its purpose?
Yep, that's its purpose.
How interesting is that, to just send out the time regularly and nothing else?
That's right. There are announcements that say the time, and the person who recorded those is long dead, unfortunately. Her name is Jane Barbie. She's well known for being the voice of many telephone companies. Did the time and temperature lines, if you remember those.
Oh, yeah, I used to call that when I was a kid.
More money comes your way when you save with First Federal Savings and Loan. At the tone, the time will be 4:56. Temperature 64.
So you mean to tell me that Jane Barbie is the one delivering the messages from your station routinely?
That's right.
Is Jane's voice soothing?
Yes.
Do you think there are people in Kauai who just enjoy listening to Jane's voice? Maybe late at night they lie in bed and just listen to her repeatedly give the time?
It's possible. It is soothing. It's very, very soothing. It ticks. Every second is a tick, and then there's a tone.
You mean to tell me if I listen to your radio station, I just hear ticks and then Jane Barbie saying the time?
That's right.
At the tone, 16 hours, 52 minutes, Coordinated Universal Time.
It's very soothing.
You ever think about just butting in, getting on the air, turning on the microphone, and saying, Steve here for Agatha's Crunch and Curl in the North Brothers Family Bowling Center and Pancake House. Just wanting you folks to know it's 4:42.
I am very tempted. A couple of the transmitters have microphone and telegraph key jacks on the front, so it would be a simple matter, because otherwise we don't have any studios.
You know what you ought to do? You ought to get on and in a deep voice just say, does anybody really know what time it is? Or you could come on and say, I've got Jane Barbie chained up in the basement.
I would never disrespect Jane. I have a little thing for Jane, you know.
At the tone, the time will be 4:56.
Why is it necessary for the government to have a station giving out the time?
Now, I think it's one of the proper roles of government is to establish standards. So the same agency that's doing this for time and frequency with this radio station is doing it for the length of an inch, the duration of a second.
What is the length of a second?
5 megahertz, 5 million cycles per second. And to define the second, which it actually produces a pulse every second out of that clock, it simply counts 5 million cycles and sends a pulse.
Wow! I had no idea what went into determining a second. Now I'm suddenly thinking to myself, what is eternity?
Well, a lot of those, I guess.
Well, you're no idiot. What else do you got going? Do you have family?
I moved here from Wisconsin, and I've enjoyed your shows for many, many years. The family is still in Wisconsin. My mother-in-law is demented. I guess she'll never hear this. My wife had to stay and care for her in our home in Wisconsin.
And you didn't stay to help her out?
Well, the previous 2 years, I was the primary caregiver. I worked for another company. I do think that part of my decision to move to an island in the middle of the Pacific may have been due to that relentless stress of caregiving for someone who has dementia.
You bugged out in a big way. I mean, you didn't exactly move to Michigan or Minnesota. I mean, you got the hell out of Dodge.
Yeah.
I don't like to be alone in my bed for one night. How do you do it? Don't you miss your wife?
I do, but she does come for visits. She's been out several times. I was just feeling a lot of pressure. It's not even my mother.
You know, a lot of times when you're at the altar and you're doing that whole for better or worse, sickness or in health, you really aren't serious. You know, I mean, we all
True,
say it,
yeah.
but the reality is when the rubber meets the road, are you kidding me? Hawaii's calling.
Yeah. I mean, there's a limit to what a person should have to stand.
And now you're just at a station and listening to a woman who's dead give the time, and you couldn't be happier.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to let you go, sir. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for calling, Tommy. Take care.
Wonderful visiting with you, Steve. You be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We walk out into the audience, and you never know who you're going to be seated next to. Take a good look at this woman. She is one of the most listened to recording artists of all time. Believe it or not, this woman's recordings are heard 25 trillion times a year. Would you do me a favor, please, and let me hear just a little bit of one of your biggest recordings?
At the tone, the time will be 8:25.
That's that famous voice on the telephone, Jane Barbie. Now, you've got to do my all-time favorite. This is a golden oldie, but I love it.
The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and dial again, or remain on the line and an operator will help you.
Jane Barbie, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Jane, ever so much. Thank you. All right.
Well, today I'm in Arlington Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia. We're up on the hill in this Arlington Cemetery, which, by the way, is a beautiful, well-maintained cemetery. But we're at the grave of Jane Barbie. I've always wanted to see this. I knew she was buried here at this location in Atlanta. Just happened to be going through here, and I thought it'd be neat to pay my respects to Jane. Feel like I know her because I've heard her voice so many times.
Goodbye.
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 Thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'll talk to you again next time. So long for now.